Hi y'all, Raidwald here. So I recently found this YouTuber called Lee Lemon, and she's got some good stuff out there. Some of which I clearly disagree with, and she seems to be arguing in good faith and seems reasonable enough, so I decided I would make a response to one of her videos. This one is about how theist evidence is not really evidence. So we'll address the types of evidence she talks about, and the points she makes, good and bad. So take it away, Lee.
Hi everyone. Whenever I talk to a theist, I always end up asking, what's your evidence, for what you believe? And regardless if they provide evidence or jump straight to this conclusion, they always end up saying something like, well, of course you're going to dismiss this evidence. You're an atheist, you're biased. Some of them say that, who am I to decide what's real evidence and what isn't? So with this video, I want to show you the four main types of evidence people provide to support their beliefs, why atheists dismiss them, and to show you that you also dismiss them when outside of your religious context. So basically, I'm just showing you that this is not evidence, and even you don't accept this type of evidence. So why would anybody accept this evidence if you provide it?
Okay, to start right off the bat, it sounds like the very caveats that you are used to hearing from theists are said precisely to communicate that these types of evidence that they have to bring are not types that are going to convince you, and they acknowledge that and they understand that. And they acknowledge that and understand that because they understand that they would not accept certain types of evidence from other people if, when they were presented to them, if it was a conclusion they didn't agree with. So, personally, less generally, more personally, the evidences which have convinced me are evidences tied directly to personal experiences which cannot be reproduced predictably by others. Now, they have been reproduced, not necessarily in exact detail, but they have been reproduced by thousands, if not millions, of people out there. But I can't predict when or where they will be reproduced. And so I understand perfectly well that such evidence will be meaningless for you. But that's the evidence that's meaningful for me. That's the evidence that actually causes me to believe what I believe. So right off the bat, I understand fully that that evidence does not constitute proof for anybody else. I know this. So what other evidence can I bring to bear? Well, I could bring some arguments to bear based off of other evidences that did not convince me to believe what I believe. And since that evidence is not what got me to believe what I believe, I can not count on it causing you to believe what I believe. Right? And so when it comes to any kind of religious belief, the only thing I think that I could count on for you to accept as proof is for you to have a personal experience similar to the ones that I have had. I can't cause that. I can't bring that to pass. We're talking about a relationship with an entity, right? My relationship with that entity does not in any way influence the way your relationship with that entity will be, can be, or is. That's entirely up to you and that entity. So I understand and I recognize the difficult position there. I cannot prove to you the truth of what I believe. In addition to this, you are in fact actually biased. So am I. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Everybody is biased. Your ideology that rejects the proposition that a God exists is just as unfalsifiable as my ideology, which proposes that God does exist. You see the same type of thing in politics as well, because political positions are unfalsifiable by their nature. And so what happens is people are, of course, going to be biased against the evidences brought to them, and confirmation bias will also cause you to simply ignore or reject evidence which goes directly against your positions. Recognizing this is in fact a good step to making sure you fall prey to it less often. And I can't imagine anybody out there that's really able to completely get rid of that tendency. But you can at least reduce its impact on you and your worldview, your approach, whatever. So, all that being said, it looks like you've made a video in response to a claim that, in response to theists, that essentially backs up the very caveats they put forward when you ask them to provide evidence. It sounds like you are more in agreement with them than disagreement. However, already in the title of the video and in what you've said so far, you've overstated your conclusion. And so that's what the remainder of this video is actually going to be about, is showing how theist evidence is in fact evidence. Whether or not you find that evidence insufficient or unsatisfactory, it's still evidence.
The first type is, my religious text proves that my God is real. Now, a lot of times the most common atheist argument here is, well, just because you have a religious text doesn't prove your God is real any more than Batman comics prove that Batman is real. But I found that when I've given that type of analogy, people always say, well, there's real stuff in my religious text. I mean, there's real stuff in there. There's stuff that ancient man never could have known. This is a scientifically sound, factual document. This is a historical document. This is true. This is stuff that, again, ancient man couldn't have known. It had to be divinely inspired. The people that typically say this, at least that I've heard, are Muslims and Christians. You guys tend to sound alike, to be perfectly honest. And with that, I just want to point out two things wrong in each text that are just factually wrong to show that this is not the case, that your book is super scientific, magical, divinely inspired.
I will, and I choose. What in the world can that be?
What? Where? I don't see anything.
That's a wonderful distraction, but it's not exactly on point. That's a wonderful distraction from the point you're trying to make, but it doesn't actually make the point you're trying to make, right? If you're trying to say that the Bible isn't revealed from God, isn't inspired of God, because of the anachronistic scientific knowledge within it, then you needed to prove either that the scientific knowledge within it is not anachronistic, or that the scientific knowledge that the Christians are pointing to is inaccurate. Pointing out that there are scientific inaccuracies in the Bible does not do this. It doesn't. It's bringing up entirely different examples that the theists are not pointing to, I'm sure for very good reasons, and trying to therefore claim that any scientific anachronisms, scientifically accurate anachronisms within the Bible, actually, I'm not sure what the logical leap you're making there is. Just because there's inaccuracies in the science doesn't mean that the accuracies which are there somehow are not, or are not anachronistic in some way. So that's a big fail on your part. So essentially the examples you're going to bring up are utterly irrelevant to the conversation at hand. However, I don't want to be seen as avoiding critiques of the Bible, so we'll go ahead and hear you out, and I'll address your points, and we'll move on from there.
The first one I'll pull from the Bible is, it says that God created a light to rule the day and a lesser light to rule the night. That's not true. The light in the day, which comes from the sun, is the same light in the night, which comes from the sun. The moon is not a light source, it is a reflector. So both lights that we see in the day and in the night are actually from the same light source. That's not what's written in the Bible. It says that there are two separate sources of light, one to rule the day and one to rule the night.
There really are far better examples that you could have gone for. I'm not sure why you went for this one. But being that you did, I can now give the very simple response that these are turns of phrases, and if not, then they're ways in which to explain things to people who don't have a sound scientific understanding of everything, right? Put yourself in God's shoes. He's trying to give people a narrative that will explain to them the meaning for which he created them. He doesn't want to give them a full textbook on how to create universes. His point is not to give a scientific thesis or document of any kind. That's not his purpose. And so this is just a small point in what he's trying to accomplish. It's tangential to it. Would he really spend a lot of time explaining to people how the solar system works just to get them to understand that there's one light at night and one light at day? I mean, they pretty much already understand that. And so he's just going to draw off of what they can see and just explain things in simple terms that they'll understand. It's not necessarily inaccurate to say that there was one light to rule the day and another light to rule the night, because without that reflector source, there wouldn't have been that light at night. Sure, there'd still be stars, but we're not talking about that, right? Because stars are their own light source. You're talking about the moon. So let's say we take away that reflector of the source of light, which is the sun. Is there that ruling light at night without the reflector?
Something else that it says is that in order to have livestock that produce offspring that are speckled, spotted, or striped, you have to have them have sex in front of something that is speckled, spotted, or striped, and then their offspring will be speckled, spotted, or striped. Simply looking at something that has a pattern does not cause that pattern to happen into your offspring, whether you look at it when you're having sex or you don't. That's not how it works. It has to do with genetics. That is factually wrong.
Now, it's understandable why you didn't cite the first one, because that's a verse very early in the Bible that most people would be able to find very easily. This is a verse that's a little further in, and you actually give no context to it, and so it could have been anywhere within well over 1,000 pages, no matter what printing of the Bible you're using, and just left it for people to find on their own. So I'll go ahead and just point people out where they can find it. We're talking about Genesis 30:36 through about 42 are the relevant verses. And let's explore the context. This, unlike what you're trying to claim, is not the Bible's declaration or understanding of the general rule of things. This is actually a miraculous occurrence. So it actually, in a lot of ways, points out the very fact of the way things work, which you already are. And let's face it, people back then knew these things. There may have been some ideas and some mythologies and rumors about getting some characteristics to be inherited from one generation to the other. However, the fact that we see domestication of animals and plants going back thousands of years before this in the archaeological record demonstrates that people knew what they were doing in terms of breeding the characteristics they wanted. So what's going on here contextually is that Jacob is tending the flocks of his father-in-law Laban, and their understanding is that Jacob gets to keep all the flocks, that all of the sheep that are considered to be blemished, right? Spotted, speckled or striped, as you were pointing out. And the sheep that were all of one color would remain Laban's. Why did Laban make this deal with Jacob? Well, because he's trying to get the better part of the deal, right? He knows his entire flock is largely one-colored. And so what he's trying to do is use those genetics in his favor. He's got the understanding that genetically, the vast majority of his flock, even if there are some rogue genes floating around out there, the vast majority of the future lambs to be born would be of one color. And so Jacob, again, with no declaration in the Bible just reports this. It doesn't say that this comes from God. It doesn't say that Jacob believed this to be scientifically sound. It says nothing of the sort. It simply says that Jacob stripped some of the bark off of some branches and put them in front of the faces of the sheep while they were mating, and that the offspring resultant from that mating were spotted and striped, and that he then took those and he separated them, and yeah, it does say he faced the flocks towards them, but it also says that he takes all of the sheep that were of one color and he separates them into a flock by themselves. In other words, he's taking the characteristics he doesn't want passed genetically on, and he's separating those sheep out from the sheep that he's going to keep. In other words, they have no chance to mate with each other. It doesn't necessarily show a sound scientific understanding in the Bible. Again, like I said, because we see people understanding these principles for thousands of years before this takes place. It doesn't necessarily have to be a revelation from God, and the Bible never claims it to be so. But what you're doing here is disingenuous. You might not understand that. I find that a lot of the same arguments float around in the atheist world, and that's going to happen in any philosophical position. You would do better to point your skepticism at yourself from time to time. This is true of everybody. It's true of me. We all have these biases built in, and it tends to lead to poor arguments and poor thinking when we point our skepticism at other thoughts, other ideas, other ideologies, other belief systems, and never re-examine our own and our own assumptions and our own arguments. Be willing to look at the context of especially of the arguments you yourself are making, and consider if those arguments are sound.
From the Quran, it says that babies start off as a blood clot. They do not. Sperm meets an egg. That's when we start this whole journey. That is not a blood clot.
Not being a Muslim myself, I'm not particularly familiar with the Quran, so I'm not going to take it upon myself to correct you. I'll leave that to other more interested parties. So, from here on out, any references to the Quran, I'll just edit out of the video, simply because I don't necessarily see the need to spend the time researching to prove you wrong here, if indeed you are to be proven wrong here. I don't know, the Quran could be an accurate representation of both context and content in the Quran. Sure.
The type of stuff in here, it seems like things that ancient man would have written with their limited knowledge of the universe and the world around them.
And here we come merrily round back to the same point I made several minutes ago. These were ancient people. There's nothing wrong with ancient peoples having their understanding pop out in the Bible. Just like there's no problem with ancient people's turns of phrase and language being visible in the Bible. It's part of their culture, the human culture, that is bound to work its way into any literary or historical work coming forth from a culture. That's always going to happen. Pointing out two instances in which that culture showed itself, manifested itself over and above any scientific understanding that might have come from God, doesn't necessarily disprove the revelatory nature of the Bible. I mean, there are so many good ways you could have made your argument. Really, very good ways you could have made your argument. But you didn't. You went down this path. And your reasoning here is no better than the Christians you are specifically trying to target with this response. Yeah, there are people out there who think that there can be no error in the Bible or the Quran. I'm not an expert in Islam, and so I'll leave it to Muslims to bring forth any defenses they want of their religion. But there are people out there that believe the Bible is literally true, every single word. But it's far easier to prove them wrong than to try to go through these means, because again, you're pulling things completely out of the context in which they're written, and even those literalists can point to the same things that I was saying, that Laban's understanding was actually pretty scientifically sound. B, the way Jacob behaved once he actually had his separate flock is, again, pretty scientifically sound. He separated out the flocks, and he was specifically breeding the ones with the attributes he wanted, and he was breeding them separately from the ones whose attributes he did not want. And C, this is clearly a miracle. This is something that's included in the Bible as something outside of the norm. And then you represent it as though the Bible says that's how it's always done. I don't think that's ever been anybody's understanding. Otherwise, people would be born looking like they have bark all over their skin or something. Like, it's pretty well understood that there are characteristics that don't just come from your environment and work their way into your body or the body of your offspring. And I think it was pretty well understood back then. Again, animal and plant domestication goes back millennia. Well, even before there was settled agriculture, people were breeding the characteristics they wanted into plants. And then, of course, with the sun and moon, there's always the retreat that God's trying to explain something that's tangential to his purpose in as little amount of time as possible. And so he's going to go to the easy explanation. And frankly, no matter where God decided to cut off his shortcut here, you still could be dissatisfied with the answer. We could have a 1,500-page text on astrophysics here, and it would still have some small inaccuracies, particularly if you put us out another couple thousand years of research and understanding, that you could point to and claim that the Bible presents a scientifically inaccurate understanding of the solar system. Right? But do you really think that this was the point for which the Bible was being written? Was this the point they were driving at? Why would they spend that long trying to be absolutely precise, absolutely accurate about the tiniest detail of the Earth's creation, when all that's really important for the point of this discussion, this narrative, is that the Earth was created by someone? I think that's really the main point that's being driven at with these verses, that the earth and the stars and the moon were created by God. And again, let's just assume that what you're trying to say here is absolutely true. That these were things meant to be understood exactly how you're understanding them, and they are clearly recorded in the Bible. Let's just say that your arguments at face value were true. What does that prove or disprove in the argument you claim you are trying to address here? Namely, that theist evidence is not evidence. If the theist argument here that there are scientific understandings present, or actually any kind of knowledge present in their book that should not have been at that time, then does pointing out a few pieces of knowledge that were incorrect really disprove that in any way? No, it's a distraction, and I think you know it's a distraction. You realize that, okay, maybe Isaiah shouldn't know by name Cyrus and exactly how he's going to go about attacking Babylon. He probably shouldn't know that. But he did. And as an atheist, you could simply make the claim that this was written or added after the fact, and there's nothing a theist could do to disprove that. See, that's more how you should respond to the arguments you're trying to make. And I'm sitting here making your argument for you, because I understand that there are limitations to what you can claim from the Bible. I get that. As a theist, I'm not the type that would say God clearly exists, or my position is clearly correct, because the Bible proves it to be so. Well, we can't really prove that anything in the Bible existed in the Bible prior to a time when it ought to have been known. We can't prove it. You can't disprove it, and so it's just kind of a back and forth, and there's no answering this yet, until such time that older texts of these biblical writings are found, which confirm the timing of their writing. But I think I've given you enough, argued your argument enough for you.
Not divinely inspired. If it was divinely inspired, these things that are factually incorrect wouldn't be in there.
Why wouldn't they? You have yet to make that argument at all.
So your book is not evidence of God. Some people talk about different prophecies that have been fulfilled. If something is vague, yes, then, at any point in time we can talk about it. Like, there's going to be more war. That's one of them. There's more war during the end times or something.
Again, I'm not going to try to make the claim that the Christians you're responding to here don't exist. I've known such people myself, and there's a place for that, right? You do need to help some people recognize when their arguments are bad and when they're not proving what they think they're proving. Likewise, and actually, by the way, that's exactly what I'm doing here with you. What you're trying to prove is not what you're actually proving. So, if you're going to refute claims of prophecies that have actually been fulfilled, then don't refute the vague ones. You have to go to what is, for your case, the worst case scenarios, something that is specific, unknowable at the time of the prophecy, and clearly referring to a single instance in history which actually occurred. Right? Now, I'm not necessarily going to present any such prophecies here myself. I haven't thought through what the best ones would be to present. That's not the point of my video. The point of my video is to point out the errors that you yourself are making in your reasoning. And this is one of them. You went for a vague prophecy. Okay, well, what about specific prophecies, like that of Isaiah prophesying Cyrus and how he would conquer Babylon? So pretty much there are just much better ways to make the arguments you're trying to make.
Well, really, war is going to happen. There are actually a bunch of prophecies that have not been fulfilled, and you can go ahead and look those up.
Prophecies rarely come with an expiration date. The ones that do either don't exist according to atheists because they actually come true, or, well, when those expiration dates go up, people stop believing in those prophecies and in those religions. That's happened several times just in the last couple of centuries. And so bringing up some prophecies in the Bible which has not yet been fulfilled doesn't necessarily prove that those prophecies will not be fulfilled, or that they haven't been fulfilled in some way that we don't yet recognize. It's again not proving the point that you're trying to make here. Pointing at some prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled does not demonstrate that prophecies which have been fulfilled were not in fact revelations from God. Doesn't prove it. And I'm going to point out here that from the outset of your whole video here, you were putting forth the proposition that the evidence that theists bring forth is not actually evidence. So far, you have not in any way attempted to make that point. You've tried to provide counter-examples to the evidence that Christians bring forth. It's not the same thing. You're bringing counter-evidence. In fact, in a lot of ways, tends to imply you understand what the theists are arguing or bringing forth is actually evidence. If the theists were not bringing forth evidence, you wouldn't bother bringing forth counter-evidence. So, again, you know, and you may have been conflating evidence with proof, but that's an error in and of itself as well. So you're not saved by running to that. Anyway, this has gone on long enough for today. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here, and I can address your other points in a future video. Thank you guys all for watching, and I hope to see you all soon.